Hello and welcome to a somewhat special edition of the War Report. This is the second episode we're putting out this week. With the current ongoing events, which the elephant in the room, as it were, we have a little bit more free time on our hands, so we figured we'd give you an extra episode right now. Now, we're going to start out with some Syria news. Now, not much significant has happened yet, but it looks like the seeds are being sown for a larger outbreak of conflict, as you were telling me.
Right. So there's been a steady, small stream of developments that have been going on for about a week. The Turks actually shelled and killed two Syrian soldiers in the greater Idlib area near Sarakib. But maybe even more alarming is that two militant leaders under Turkish command have been killed. And again, it's this mysterious Kurdish group called the Afrin Liberation Army. And they focus mostly in the Turkish-held area of Afrin and the surrounding province there. So two militant leaders, along with their bodyguards, five in total, were killed. And an IUD exploded in the middle of Afrin, not killing anyone, but destroying military vehicles. So they're ramping up. Earlier this week and last week, we mentioned that they had targeted some vehicles on the road, but now I think they're becoming bolder and striking within the city limits. And frankly, they must have some good intelligence because they're taking out leaders.
Yeah.
Also, in Idlib, the ongoing fortification that Turkey is doing, even in greater Idlib, I should add, not just along the M4 and M5, and not just in the militant jihadist-held area, is ongoing. And, this is not good because it provides a countermeasure should the Syrian army decide to, retake the rest of Idlib. And that seems likely because the amount of attacks from the rebels has increased. And eventually, this will force Russia's hand. It will have to support the Syrian fighters. I still don't know what the Turks are going to do with those. I'm being facetious. We know exactly what the Turks will do, but will they use their anti-air defense system against Russian and Syrian planes? Most likely Syrian, but it could escalate. And there's no, the ceasefire was never going to work. And if you look at these events, if you isolate them, you might not think they're all that significant, but they're ongoing. They're almost on a daily basis right now, and something will have to be done.
Yeah, and
the other area of contention is the highway, and in the area of Deir ez-Zor. This is not far from Palmyra. Another convoy, this time of an Iraqi Hezbollah-linked group who has been fighting along with Assad to get rid of ISIS. ISIS has struck there. There were reports that ISIS was increasing its presence. Of course, there's that U.S.-held territory in east central Iraq. You've probably seen it on our maps in the past many times. It's a rather large area, and that's one of the areas ISIS can go to and not be attacked by the U.S., as opposed to the Kurdish-held areas. So, as long as ISIS and other terrorists are attacking Assad, that's okay, which has always been America's position anyways. But as long as that area is there and they have a safe haven, this will only go on. And this is why I doubt that America will actually ever leave that region unless, America's circumstances dramatically change in the next few years. But the only other development that I'm seeing in Syria is huge concrete blocks are being delivered. These are for outposts. They're going to strengthen, basically, Turkish defensive positions there. And even though some of the rebels have actually killed Turkish soldiers, there seems to be a kind of coordination and a realignment occurring. Um, some of these militants are being passed off as if they're moderates, and they're not, of course.
Well, those CIA de-radicalization programs, they really do the job. I think you need to have more confidence in our intelligence agencies.
Yes, that's right. So that's all I have for Syria. Look for next week for escalations to increase, and probably because Syria has also increased its its forces along the perimeter of the jihadist held territory. Look for just an all out battle that is going to happen. So by the end of next week, sometime between next Friday and then, like, yeah, I would suspect something will. There's going to be a major flashpoint because it can't go on. They're determined to win back Idlib. These people, uh, unless they're eliminated, they just won't stop.
Now, you brought this up, but I figured I'd expound further about the ISIS attacks. Now, you actually said that right before I was going to. This is from South Front, and they say ISIS kills and injures 10 Iraqi fighters along the Syrian border with Deir Zor, and you went into that. And we are seeing these resurgence in ISIS attacks, and again, I think we can all pretty much pinpoint why exactly that is happening. And also, to further your point, things are coming to a breaking point. Something's going to have to be done. And with the current elephant in the room, with the current global crisis, which I will avoid mentioning just for the sake of brevity and for the sake of this very sensitive platform, this is going to make it either go in one extreme or the other. This is either going to spur them on where they think this is the perfect cover we need. Now, this could be the anti-Assad forces. This could be the Assad forces thinking we can end this right now. We can finish off Idlib, whatever. Or they're going to realize this is too bad. We can't act now. We're putting ourselves in danger just going up against the forces of nature.
Right, and we should mention this is not an. I'm not in any way lumping the attack in Deir ez-Zor with the attacks around Afrin and Idlib.
You may not be, but
Yeah, I mean that's an important aggregate as well. But this is the third significant attack. They destroyed an entire convoy. They executed people that were caught. Some of them delivering humanitarian aid. Uh, this is like, and America is not going to do anything about this because, I mean, like Israel, they would prefer that you know Assad is defeated rather than ISIS.
yeah, and they've outright said as much that they prefer ISIS forces to the Iranian-backed forces and Assad. That now that's going back to 2014 with Lieberman and everything. But yeah, that's all we have for Syria. I don't expect much to come out of it today or tomorrow, but like you said, over the next week, maybe a week after that, something will happen. And like you also said, yeah, things could accelerate very quickly. Also considering all the other things going on around the world. Now, the main reason I wanted to do this episode, we touched on this at the end of last episode, is the problems with the global trade regime, with free trade, what have you, and some of the supply shortages and the mask wars and international corporations really just, uh, well, for example, the thing we mentioned with Australia, I believe it actually was a Chinese businessman who uh, Chinese dual citizen who ended up selling the medical supplies back to China, and we've seen several cases in the United States where, of course, dual Israeli citizens have done the same with Israel, where the Israeli government is actually leaning on Western governments to buy their medical supplies. They started doing this way before people started becoming concerned about this, like back in February and early March. But the most recent story we have, and I think I'm just going to use this to springboard off the rest, is of course we know with all the medical supplies going back to China, uh, they have not missed an opportunity to really turn a profit here. And they're now selling back these masks and these medical supplies. And what happened was, as a plane full of medical supplies was to leave Shanghai for France, American buyers at the last minute agreed to pay 3 times more than what the French paid for those medical supplies. So we're in sort of a I mean, I think the best word I can put this, it's becoming a jungle where it's every nation for itself. There's no consideration for cooperation or coordination between any of them. Not that I'm saying we need to hold hands, peace pipe that garbage, but I'm just saying we've gotten to the point where even in times where nationalistic figures would put the interests of their nations first, it's become a zero sum game where it's do or die. And it's an understandable mindset right now, but a lot of nations that didn't take the precautions, which admittedly are most nations, are now scrambling to collect whatever they can, and like I said, are willing to get in the mud and uh, really act like this is the crisis situation that it is. I don't know any better way to put that.
Right. Also, we should mention that a few weeks ago, the U.S. Placed sanctions on Turkey of medical aid that was supposed to be delivered to France and I believe Germany and Britain as well. So that's two strikes. I mean, it's proposed that there's a unity, in the Western world for Western values and so on, but that's not convincing. So we've seen the European Union not look very unified, and now we're seeing America's relationship with the EU looking equally as divisive. Um, I frankly don't know, like, what was the reason to sanction these supplies that were already paid for. Um, I'm presuming they're still in Turkey. I have no idea if the sanctions have yet been lifted, and then to outbid, essentially strong arm the Chinese into higher profits, and because the epidemic right now in Europe is also very high. All the countries from last week have had now double the amount of deaths. Uh, France is at close to 6,000. Italy is going to be 15,000. The UK is over 2,500. Like, Germany's over 1,000 now. All these, some of these countries had very low numbers. Spain is over 10,000. I don't think this is going to go forgotten. And, things are going to be very strained after this. And, we haven't even gotten to, the economic fallout that's inevitable from all this. That will create an environment where these past grievances are only going to be highlighted, in the pattern that is developing. So, if this is a strong-arm tactic for Europe to fall in line with America's wishes, I think this is going to backfire. And we've seen that already happening because the EU has signed off. Britain and France primarily are sending aid to Iran. America will boast on Fox News and other channels that they're offering aid to Iran, but Iran is refusing it. The truth is, Iran needs loans now. Even IMF loans, which usually America is for, are being denied because, well, they're Iran, or they're Venezuela, so they have to suffer through this. It's ridiculous when, they complain about, what China did to us, and or the Russians are using their help as a propagandistic tool, but they're levying sanctions that are having a direct impact. they're taking advantage of this situation far more than other countries are. Far more.
Oh, it's the sort of, I don't want to say empire in decline, but empire in retreat, really lashing out, trying to project whatever power it can. While I mean, as all the examples you just listed, these countries acting independently of American hegemony. And what we're seeing here is, especially with the case with Iran, with the French aid and the other European aid, is American sanctions are very quickly becoming a joke, even within the United States. You look at the aid Russia has offered to not only Italy, but several other European countries. Serbia was the newest one. They pledged Serbia if there was an outbreak there, they would send aid. I believe they've been sending aid to Spain. Germany, I'm not sure,
Yep.
but I know Spain and Italy are the big two that they've been sending aid to. Nobody in Washington is concerned. I mean, plenty of people in Washington are concerned, but nobody in Washington is concerned enough at this current moment to actually act against Russian violation of sanctions beyond complaining on the media or in front of Congress or on Twitter or wherever. Uh, Again, obviously, Spain and Italy and these other countries affected by outbreak do not care. That's probably the last thing on their mind right now. Russia obviously does not care. Uh, we're seeing the complete breakdown of a system that was slowly unraveling, and probably would have gone this direction eventually. Maybe not to this degree or under these sort of pressing matter, at this speed either. But
Hmm.
again, we've seen the United States throughout the 2010s not really have any major foreign policy victories, and of course, conservatives will attribute that to Obama's leading from behind. Liberals will say Trump ruined the United States' international reputation. Now, of course, beyond the partisanship, it's just the nature of our empire, the length of its existence since the end of the post-war era. It mostly, what not to get on too much tangent, you can attribute it to age. You can attribute it to the amount of time it has spent in the seat of global power, as it were. But
Yeah.
it just shows
Go on.
that the rules-based world order, that all these liberal values and Western unity, and all the things we have been sold since the 90s, under the slightest amount of pressure, and I'm not saying this is some minor event. Look, I'm not saying we're at Spanish flu levels yet. Time will tell how bad this will be, but for now, it's one of the most serious challenges we've faced, I would say, since 9/11. And the big distinction since 9/11 is, look, as terrible it was, 9/11 was one day in terms of the impact, in terms of the deaths, whereas this is an ongoing, as it stands, months long crisis. It'll probably continue throughout most of the year, maybe over a year. I don't know. I'm not an expert on the projections here. But my point is, when it's put under an amount of scrutiny that you'd think, oh, a competent government could handle this. If there's a pandemic, if there's any kind of crisis, we can trust our civil authorities. We pay our taxes. Sort of the mindset of the normal American, I guess you could say pre 9/11. Just go back to that. But all of those systems that have been put up on a pedestal since the 90s that are beyond reproach, democracy, so-called freedoms, whatever the hell that means, global trade, multilateralism, cooperation amongst the nations, is all completely gone out the window.
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, as big a challenge as this is, and it is, and we're not, of course, I don't think we've ever minimized it. And as it develops, I think we've basically covered it correctly in terms of its importance and impact that it's having. But um, that said, there have been actually other times where the West has been challenged even more so than it is now. But the cooperation is simply not there. It's just non-existent right now. And whatever is done is very token, and a lot of this is contradictory. I'm very sure that the U.S. will introduce new sanctions on Russia, including the company that actually delivered or was responsible for the supplies to the U.S. is actually a company that was sanctioned by the U.S. That's the irony of it. Um, so, you know, I doubt even if, if Hillary were in charge, that a lot of this would have gone any better. To be really frank, because this isn't strictly about leadership. It's quite systemic. Um, you'll know. I mean, we all remember that early on, in January. I would say conservatives were in some ways more concerned, or let's say they were opportunistic about borders,
Yeah, a lot
about the
of
issue.
media and
And
politicians. Yeah, a lot of media and politicians really jumped on this, but then once Trump sort of gave the order from on high, "Don't worry about this. This is no big deal." A lot of them fell in line.
right. And so, early on, basically the liberal order, the order that like Hillary would have been leading, they would have done what Pelosi did. They would have told people to go to Chinatown in San Francisco and show people that you're not a xenophobe or a racist. The Washington Post most likely would have had the same articles about how this is just the flu, bro. Right? They did in February, no less. This is after the major shutdown in Wuhan and Hubei that China did. So you know what? A lot of this would have been exactly the same way. I know a few episodes back, I kind of half jokingly said that Biden would have done better and he would have been eating ice 2 scoops. but I don't think so. I look now; it's so systemic. It's so across the board, and by reevaluating, I mean, even De Blasio telling people, "Oh, you shouldn't avoid going out in public. This is like a cold. Don't miss out on the Italian Film Festival, for goodness sake." Like, it's ridiculous, right? And they all did that, and now, ironically, what Trump should have done is handled this in a very serious way, and the libertarian morons would should have been just laughed at, and he would have won a political victory. But all they did was play this kind of game where they had a position, he went against it, they changed their position, and now he's had to conform to their position. It's quite sad, actually.
Yeah, I mean,
to watch.
Theoretically, at least early on, for whatever reason, I had some hope that Trump may be able to salvage some of his 2016 campaign promises out of this. He can be the unifying leader. He can be the leader in the time of crisis, the wartime president, as he will, but even without the war. And he could say, like, for example, his first address, which a lot of people thought was lackluster, myself included, but early on, like when I first listened to it, it's like, we're going to shut down borders, we're going to temporarily suspend travel and trade with China and Europe. Really, if he would have just kept on that rhetoric, kept on following through with that, it could have been great for him. And if he kept through on more the economically more left-leaning and populistic platforms, such as we're gonna waive healthcare costs, we're gonna move to expand Medicare and Medicaid, which he has revived that sort of talk. We're going to issue emergency payments. We're going to, for example, bail out the American people, as it were, rather than the corporations. He had the perfect opportunity in front of him.
Yeah.
And then he squandered
Exactly.
it. Whereas with a lot of the Democrats, like, again, it would have been like the Pelosi de Blasio, go enjoy Chinatown. Don't be a xenophobe. Have some Chinese food. You got to get out and support the economy and support this whatever diversity event. Whereas, yeah, you'd expect that from Hillary, from Biden, from the Democrats. Whereas, look, Trump didn't necessarily go along that lines, but again, just shy of that. Where, like I said, in theory, Trump, this would have been the golden opportunity for him to be the unifying president and to sail into the 2020 election almost unopposed.
Right. And, not that it was, I think, an intentional bait and switch, but it worked out that way regardless. He fell for this bait and switch. Really. Like, if he had just stuck to his guns, he would have been proven right. And for like all the other, like, I see other channels where like, and they're good channels. Like, they have good content. They're level-headed. Unfortunately, though, they have this ever enduring, abiding belief in Trump, and they'll say things like, "In time, he'll be proven right again." It's like, how? He's had two polar opposite takes on this virus,
I mean,
right? And he you know, he literally, like, whether it was intentional or not, he fell for it, and he should never have done that. Like you say, if he had stuck to his guns, the nationalists would have been appeased, and eventually the same kind of lack of woke takes that we hear now, except, the trans community is literally experiencing Holocaust. Like, if he had done that, he would have been so successful right now. But I think not just pressure toward him by people, even with his own group, let's say, his own sort of staff and influencers. I'm sorry, but they're slightly more conservative neoliberals, and they're probably telling him, like, you do this, and A, B, and C is going to happen to our economy. Are you crazy? And so, very much in the vein of the way the UK handled it, Britain, France, Germany, none of them took it too seriously. And the fact is, France actually started to notice that this was probably going to get very bad. And they acted probably faster than, not that it was fast, but they acted faster than any of the other EU nations. I suppose, Italy did as well, but Italy had to contend with, with an area in northern Italy, Milan, and so on, where there are a lot of Chinese migrants, worker migrants who live there, who are legally there, with direct flights to Wuhan and so on. But that said, yeah, he could have handled it far better than he did. And now he's like, it looks like the media again is driving the narrative, and he's reacting to it. He's not leading the narrative. And he's not going to appease them, right? They got what they wanted out of him, right? And of course, it's tiring. I mean, it's tiring for me, and I'm not even an American. And of course, for Americans, it must be extremely tiring with every single presser of a CNN reporter or one of the other alphabet letter reporters, preempting a question, given that A, B, and C, and you didn't react quick enough, and a lot of millions of more Americans could potentially die. Do you think the current subject, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? They literally start off every question like this. Every question is a gotcha question. And so you have, to use a Moldbug term, this inner fight between the blue and red empire. That's really been on display ever since 2016. That is really the conflict that we're seeing, and as you've mentioned before, it is like, if maybe an empire not in decline, definitely in some kind of retreat, because those two empires are supposed to work efficiently, even with their contradictions. The well-educated Europeans are supposed to be pro-blue empire, right? Soft power. And they're supposed to really, hate the Republicans in the same way that American liberals hate them. But what's happening is not so much like a fight between red and blue empires geopolitically, but in internal dynamics, in an internal struggle. And, basically when Trump said that it should be U.S. foreign policy to make sure that gay marriage is legalized in every country around the world, that those two empires they've crossed over. They've as much as they're fighting it out, they've crossed over. And for a red empire leader to say something like that as a kind of foreign like the number one foreign policy of the United States isn't just appeasement to the Blue Empire. It's um, he's not like a Red Empire leader isn't supposed to say that. Even by Blue Empire standards, this is why they don't care if it's the lowest unemployment rate for blacks in America, although that's going to change. Um, that's not the way it works. So, anyways, I'm finished with my tangent.
No, I'm glad you brought that up because I actually want to continue on that. With the red and the blue empire thing, a lot of people understandably fall into the trap of thinking, oh, Republicans and Democrats are just the same. They're just, it's just a fake floor show they're putting on for us. With a lot of things that is true, but in terms of how to govern the empire, there are some very heated debates. Now, they agree on the supremacy of this global empire and on all of the basic points. But again, it breaks down to the debate between hard power and soft power. What do we do here? What do we do here? Whereas the blue, the Democrat thinks we have to be this moral beacon and like shining leader of the world. Whereas again, with the red, the Republicans, it's we have to be the strongest force and everyone has to fall in line behind us. Where it's interesting you mention it in terms like with Trump, it's almost as if he's tried to fuse both with the decriminalization of homosexuality and the promoting women in the workforce and whatever part of the world that was a big thing. I think they're trying to like empower African women. Some program like that, some Ivanka led program. No surprise
Yeah,
there.
yeah,
But he's combined. You're gonna accept these great moral truths and this shiny beacon of light at gunpoint. I mean, it's
right.
almost interesting how when you combine the two, the mask completely slips.
Yes, and the other thing is the Blue Empire in terms of soft power and cultural power and cultural influence. Where are they supposed to go if the Red Empire says, "I'm going to make sure gay marriage is legal all over the world"? Like, and then people ask, like, why is it so crazy? It's like, well, where are liberals supposed to go if conservatives are saying this is great? And and I can understand, like, if you looked at the last 20, 30 years, I think one of the reasons why, let's say, Red Empire America is concerned about the way Blue Empire America is handling the situation is, well, for one, China, right? So basically the Blue Empire philosophy is that you get them on board, they can receive aid, influence. Basically you're buying them off, or
Yeah,
you're
The
cooperating with them.
Brzezinski sort of point of view about China.
Right. Right. So economically, you're going to integrate them more, and that's when you put in your cultural apparatchiks, whether it's the way Tibetans are created or gay marriage and so on. Right. And no, not entirely, but for the most part, the vast majority of times, China has been very resilient in resisting, the pause, right? And Russia has too. In terms of culture, they've been in some ways even more successful, or will be more successful. Especially with the inevitable, I think, introduction of God in their constitution, and that marriage can only be between a biological man and a woman, and so on and so on. So at that point, the Blue Empire has nothing. And the Blue Empire has relied on the Red Empire for two basic tasks, and one of those is to cut taxes to the rich so they don't have to do it, and the other is to act as a bludgeon for certain conflicts. Not that they always agree on how that should be done or the scale of it.
Yeah, I think one of the best examples
As a matter of
is
fact, they don't. Yeah,
yeah,
and you could also argue with what? Sorry.
uh, just to continue on in terms of like how they don't always agree on military, for example, where Hillary was we have to be hard on Syria, where Trump was we have to be hard on Iran, where none of them think what are we doing here? Why don't we just take a moment, actually evaluate the situation, question what we're doing here? It's the fact that Trump is bad for going after Iran because he didn't take out Assad first, whereas I can't believe the Democrats want to take out Assad without going after Iran, and that's pretty much the at least in the Middle Eastern context, foreign policy debate.
Right, right, which became a debate about How many Al Qaeda and ISIS groups should we work with in Syria versus how many? How can we increase the sanctions and maybe get into a limited conflict with Iran? That was essentially the argument, and I think you know now we can see back from 2013 and 14. The Republicans, basically denying Obama the opportunity to go into Syria full scale, in a way, that was them prioritizing Iran, as you well put it. Uh, and those arguments are still going on, and like, well, I mean, Assad is still here, and Iran, in many ways, beleaguered as it is, and under stressful sanctions. Is having an enormous influence, is increasing its power, and Yemen is a great example of that. Not to get into Yemen, but like they are on the brink of capturing one of the major cities whose name escapes me at the moment. But should that happen, you're going to see major collapse of Saudi-backed forces. Saudi Arabia probably in retaliation will begin bombing some of their major cities as a result, and ports and so on. But yeah, so you know what, the this crossover that has happened, it is an appeasement. It is basically the Red Empire kind of begging for mercy from the blue, but at the same time, the blue doesn't have an army to fight with, or have. So, you know, uh, their ideology is suffering at the moment as well. So it's just generally bad. They're arguing and they're overextending, and so the entire way that this apparatus is supposed to work isn't working.
Yeah, it's I couldn't have said it better myself, but now that we've sort of gotten to the dynamics of the red and blue empire that we touched on briefly last episode, but never got the opportunity to get fully into, I think now is a good time to pivot to the question of international trade, which we briefly touched on this episode, but I don't think we gave it proper airing in this episode of the next. So, just for the brief history, we all know that in, I believe it was 1972, Nixon took his visit to the People's Republic of China, met with Mao, and what you could say is normalized relations. Now, that was part of a broader global strategy to drive the wedge between Russia and China that was already growing, but of course we were capitalizing it, and to come to something of a peace settlement in the Vietnam War. Now, arguably that was successful to a degree, but once the floodgates were open for China, as it went on, as especially after Mao's death and the succession of other leaders who moved more towards a mixed economy model into arguably more of a, I guess, say free market model. Especially in the 80s and 90s, we saw American industry flood over into East Asia in general, China in particular. Now, later, of course, we'd go into Vietnam, Indonesia, India. I think you get the point here. And that's a world we've been living with since, I would put it like the free trade era post Cold War, about 30 years now. And in 2004, of course, we outsourced our pharmaceutical manufacturing abroad, mainly to China. And of course, 2004 was also the same year we reported the severe shortage of ventilators we had in this country. So you're seeing how all these things came together. And we touched on this. This was all very short-sighted. It played into that sort of Fukuyama point of view that this is the end of history. The globalized world will reign forever. We've overcome the oppression of monarchy and religious authorities, and now we've overcome fascism and communism, and liberalism stands unopposed. All we have to do is deal with some nuisances in the Middle East and Asia, and Russia, they're subdued. China, they're content being a manufacturing colony. Africa, look at all that liberalism there. We just got to take care of Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. We have the perfect globalized liberal world, and of course, as we laid out, even before all of this, even in the 2010s, I would say more with the resurgence of Russia, Syrian civil war, failure of the Arab Spring, we started to see the cracks in that. And as we said before, especially this year, especially with recent events, we're really seeing the cracks in that. But it goes back to the point where, yeah, we made a massive mistake outsourcing to China, but I fear what the neoconservatives will do, since I think in the minds of the neoconservatives slash Brzezinski, there's several distinct differences, but again, it goes back to the red versus blue dynamic, where they mostly agree on everything. I think the more hawkish neoconservatives have reached a breaking point with China, where they realize they're no longer a valuable member of the global empire, for lack of a better term, and they will cut them off, even if it means giving them over to more Russian influence. And then instead of bringing industry home, instead of bringing it uh, back to the American people, they will move it to these other manufacturing colonies they've set up, whether that be Indonesia, whether that be India, whether that be Vietnam. Now, of course, it won't be as successful, it won't be as profitable, but at that point, they've burned their bridge with China and they're going to have to live with the reality they have created. And it's going to be very cynical because they're going to do this on they're going to do the faux nationalism thing that they always do when they want to drum up something that is usually not for the benefit of the American people. Because as like I just said, they're going to drum it up like we're going to take our industry out of China. Whereas in the mind of the average American who isn't necessarily politically in tune, they're going to think that must mean the jobs are coming back home. That must mean, my town's auto plant that hasn't been open in 40 years. We're going to start making cars
Right.
again. We're going to start making TVs again. Whatever. And then they're going to be, in for a rude awakening when all of that again moves to other Asian nations or African nations.
Yeah, you don't get the sense that they're going to learn their lesson, and ultimately, the reason they can't learn their lesson is because of the ideology of profits and bottom line over the short term, and that is the governing rule. They're not able to really create. Part of it is hubris. Part of it is based on past success, and what World War II brought them in terms of the Bretton Woods Agreement and so on. But they're not able to project a plan for their nation for the next 20, 30 years, 50 years, outside of just geopolitical wars, that, sometimes have more to do with, other countries or let's say the integrity of trade, oil trade, American dollar, so on, right? They are bound to that, and that is a problem. But I don't see any kind of plan, basically, where they can change the dynamic so that, for instance, during a crisis like this, America literally actually does have 2 or 3 plants where that are pharmaceutical factories. In which case, right now there aren't. Right, like just imagine like the hubris you would need to think like you wouldn't need any. And really, the only explanation is just it's profit, right? You see a lot of MAGA-pedes on Fox News comments, on YouTube comments, and that you can tell how wedded they are to this economy. And in a way, what they're wedded to is just the table scraps. To be really honest about it, they get very concerned when it could be that China is ruining their economy, because in some way they frankly know there isn't anything else. That everything else is, let's say, unable to meet a crisis like this, as I pointed out with pharmaceutical factories, and there's other ones as well, like only having one place that produces masks. So then what you're forced to do is sanction countries, for wanting to buy masks, and then outbid to buy masks that were destined to these other countries because you sanctioned them in the first place. Like, there wouldn't have been that, like, France and Brazil and the UK wouldn't have probably bought those masks that were stopped on the tarmac in China had sanctions not been placed on Turkey, who was going to sell them to them anyways. And then the lack of planning, the lack of coordination is really, it's extraordinary. So yeah, but the economy is sacred. The economy is always sacred because the economy, in many ways, is like directly tied to the notions of freedom, right?
Yeah, and
there's no, you're not free unless you're powerful, right? And you're not powerful unless the economy is good. So
yeah, and you brought something up, so I have to expound upon that with sort of the ridiculousness of the masks wars, where we really can't decide what we're doing. And again, that's not just us. Most nations have no idea what the hell we're doing, and that just goes to the general lack of preparedness to the uh, again, this liberal system we just got into. But from Twitter right here, Trump said he had sent nearly a thousand. Trump said he had sent thousands of masks to New York, but they never reached there. Now, the FBI tracked these masks to the houses of Israelis who were hoarding them. Now, it's being investigated, and there's a strong belief that these Israelis are tied to intelligence. So, no surprises there. And again, like, there is. I do not want to let China off the hook for how much they dropped the ball in this scenario, but I also want to get into the fact that the, we have left ourselves so vulnerable that, look, it's not only China doing it, they're a major offender, but our so-called allies, and look, I think we've gone over plenty of criticism of Israel on the show, but we've we've painted a target on our backs. That's not just us, the entire Western world, for the sake of short-term profits, has
yeah,
allowed this to happen. It's mind-boggling.
yeah, and of course, along with that, it's like, well, there's just no other way.
Yeah,
It's the economy. You can't judge the economy. Can't do it.
we might upset the market gods. You know, they might not give us a bountiful harvest this year.
Right. It's ridiculous. Yeah, I mean, I'm honestly at a loss for words. I've been looking at these headlines for a few days now, and it's just not. It hasn't changed. It hasn't changed since 2008 and 2009.
Yeah. Uh, the last thing I want to close out on, we sort of touched on this last episode, but this has sort of become the tying up loose ends episode for last week, is sort of the oil war truce that had been declared between Trump's phone calls with Putin and MBS. And it seems like the Russians and the Saudis have agreed to cut some productions. Now, mainly out of this, Russia said that it did cut a bit into their budget to uh, drop the oil price so much, and that cutting back production is actually going to raise it a bit. But I saw it. I saw something interesting that
Hmm.
one of the main lines of Russian thought is, look, it's global recession time anyway. Things are going down the tube, regardless of our actions at this point. So we might as well completely take down the American oil industry with us, and we might as well just completely devalue oil while we're at it. Now, it seems like Putin has not adopted that strategy, and I would say, despite everything that happened with the massive drop in oil to the point where it was below $20 a barrel, we got a small taste of what the Russians could tolerate. I believe over the month of March, in terms of their emergency fund, which is again, I think in like the tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars, and then on top of that, there's other assets. There's other things they can draw on. I'm not sure how big their fund is. I think they predicted it would last 5 years, but in the month of March, I think it was like around $700 million they dipped into. Now, of course, that includes extenuating costs dealing with the quarantines and the paid vacations and the other uh, measures they need to take to fight this disease outbreak. But whereas under normal circumstances, if there was an oil downturn, they wouldn't need to dip into that much of the fund. But I think we got a small taste of what Russia can weather, and I wouldn't say it's anything spectacular, but in terms of the absolute piss poor preparedness we saw from Western nations, whether that be the U.S., Germany, UK, France, Italy, it looks like they're ready for the next several decades.
Yeah, I think that basically, like the fact that Putin says, "Well, you know what? Nobody spoke to me." This I'm tempted to believe Putin here rather than Trump, um, because first of all, it's Trump who asked for things to go back to normal, which means two things: Saudi Arabia was panicking, and so was the American shale industry because, like, oil was going for like less than $20 a barrel, and shale can't survive unless it's over 40. So they cried uncle. Maybe on top of all of this, Russia sending aid to Trump, is an enormous flex. But essentially, yeah, you're right. Russia weathered this quite well. It probably will not mean the end of America's shale industry, but I would say that some of the smaller operations are going to go out of business. And that at the moment, oil is still not where it needs to be in order for them to be competitive. Like, let's not forget that. Like, there's still like at least $15 under from just breaking even. So it's not there.
I think one of the biggest things we learned in terms of this very short lived oil war, that whether we be talking about the American shale industry, the Gulf oil states, Iranian oil, Russian energy industry, most, if not all, of the energy production market and how it's propped up is fake and gay.
Yes.
I mean, because with the amount they're pumping out of the ground, the amount they just keep on pumping out of the ground, it shows that realistically, this seems like a very abundant resource and maybe not as scarce or peak oil as they spent decades telling us. Maybe they were, had a little bit of a miscalculation on that end of all things, but it seems like the only thing propping up the energy industry is that several nations' economies, if, a large part, if not the majority of their economy, is dependent on energy production. Now, I think there's honestly more of a case for that with natural gas, but in terms of oil, with again, maybe I'm completely misreading the situation. Maybe this is a very shallow view of it, but with the amount they pumped out of the ground just in since the beginning of this year, it makes me seem like, yeah, maybe there's something they're not telling us about the oil industry.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard, I mean, I've read, shouldn't say heard. I've read some articles saying that, Saudi Arabia in the best of times has like a 6 month supply if they were going to ramp up the amount of oil that they're exporting, even at $55 a barrel and so on. I'm not an expert at it. And, frankly, I feel like Saudi Arabia has already gone through those times as well. So I'm not so sure how valid that point is. But not that you should be, paying attention to me as some kind of an expert on oil. But that said, I guess what they're hinting at is that even under normal circumstances, Saudi Arabia is having a difficult time because, as we've covered in the past, they basically their public infrastructure depends on the sale of oil, in a way greater than that of Russia's. And of course, Russia, they didn't dip into their $1 billion fund. That it's not 1 billion, it's several billion, in order to weather this out. But yeah,
Yeah, the
they
thing is,
have.
Russia still has a massive industrial base, and ever since the implementation of sanctions, domestic industries actually had something. I wouldn't call it a boom, but just shy of it. Russia isn't the giant gas station in Eastern Europe and Northeastern Asia that we've been told it is since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Look, now they did have problems with over reliance on the energy sector, especially in the 2000s and in the lead up, I would say, to the annexation of Crimea, but it seems like whatever flaws that may have been, it seems like I wouldn't say entirely ironed them out, but at least in the direction where they've diversified their economy, as it were. It's not like Saudi Arabia or Venezuela where they put all their eggs in one basket, and then when oil goes down, their economies are screwed.
Yeah, they have diversified, and they've reacted pretty skillfully to this, and they did it with a very limited democracy.
Huh.
Trans rights were impeded upon during the whole process. Yeah, and I mean that's kind of what I mean on a sort of smaller scale about a country being able to determine what it thinks it needs to do for the next 20, 30 years, whereas China would be an example of a very large nation of much more powerful economy, doing the same. And of course, I think to Westerners, that kind of tension existing within our elite, we do want it to some degree because we believe that it keeps them honest. Of course, this is completely, or almost entirely, completely subverted, and this is in a way why people have they've lost a great amount of faith, if not like almost all of it, in mainstream media. There's a lot of events that have occurred, say, in the last 20 years where, disbelief of the official line from the government and media is, upwards of 35 to 50, 60%. So, how can I put it? Like, there's a lot of mistrust, and this mistrust actually manifests itself quite differently in the upper echelons of American power. But I think, in a way, to the average person, and I would say more so to the average person who supports Trump or leans to the right, it's become more obvious about how, the media, of course, the media, does make some valid points against Trump. Trump is, he is a bit of a buffoon. But I think what they're noticing is something much broader than that, and it's not just dependent on Trump. And the pattern didn't begin with him. And
if only Hillary won, none of this would be happening. The lack of confidence Europe has, it would have never happened. Now, the only reasonable case they could make is France may not have gone on its more recent, I guess, call it independent streak. Now, that's always existed since the inception of NATO, since the formation of the post-war order. But I could see France being more obedient, like a Germany, had an establishment candidate came to power, even an establishment Republican.
Yeah.
But yeah, ultimately, their narrative is like, oh, Trump made this flub again. It's things that are legitimate criticisms against Trump, like he completely botched a fact that a president should know, or came off like a moron. Again, we've showed this in previous episodes. The map of approval of American leadership, I believe, it was in the year 2018 was the most recent one we have. Yeah, Hillary wouldn't have changed this, and arguably she would have made worse in some parts. For example, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, with some of the migrant waves her wars may have caused. But yeah, in terms of that, it's like it's a systemic problem. It goes beyond orange buffoon, as it were.
Yeah. Yeah, very much so.
I think that's a wrap. I think we covered all our bases here.
Yeah, I guess this was a speedy one.
Actually, we're just shy of an hour right now, so we went about normal length.
Oh, how long has it been?
Uh, we're about to cross the hour mark in 20 seconds.
Quick, think of another subject. But yeah, I mean that's essentially like all I've had to say. So uh, I don't know how much more. I mean, the only thing I could add is we're looking at the unemployment rate right now. So we're just under 7 million requests for unemployment insurance or unemployment aid. Um, we call it unemployment insurance in Canada, but uh, yeah, this is like basically this is going to push the unemployment rate very high, and it jumped by like basically in the last 2 weeks we're seeing like 10 million requests.
Yeah, I think it's the worst
If
it's
you
been
lump all the weeks together.
since the 82 1982 uh,
Yeah,
economic crisis, which again we'll probably have more economic news in uh, next week in terms of the unemployment claims. Not only, of course, in the U.S., but looking in Europe and other areas that have had a major economic downturn due to this. And again, we talked about it at the beginning of this year that Germany, again, they reported 0.1% growth and are probably in reality beyond their cooked books in a recession as we speak. I think the entire globe has entered a recession as we speak. But again, we'll touch more on that next week. We just wanted to cover some loose ends. And I think we did a good job. And depending on how much free time we have, depending on how schedules go and how quarantines go, we may do the show a couple times a week going forward for the
yeah,
foreseeable future. It all depends. We might do one weekday, one weekend show. We'll keep you posted.
yeah.
But with that, I think that's a wrap. So we'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye.